All right, I'm going to start again just so that we have a full recording. Welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you being here. My name is Alyssa Feinerman. I've been a Santa Monica resident for the past 11 years. I am an executive coach after spending about 10 years in finance. I went to Wharton Business School, and I now serve on the Wilmont board, so I might know some of you from there. I really appreciate the opportunity to facilitate our community discussion tonight with Interim Police Chief Seabrooks and some members of her team. And one of the actions requested by the city after the unrest of May 31st was to put together an independent after-action report and evaluate the events leading up to, during, and following May 31st, 2020. The goal was to address questions and concerns about what happened on that day, as well as to provide recommendations. The comprehensive 117-page public report prepared by the OIR, Office of Independent Review, has 21 findings and 44 recommendations, which deal with a host of issues, but some of the highlights are transparency, leadership, communication, operational and process issues, use of force, reviewing, updating policies, and training, to highlight a few areas. The Santa Monica Police Department also put together a 19-page document responding to the 44 recommendations. Our focus for this town hall is to discuss the police department's response to the OIR report, the themes, and recommendations. I'd like to take a moment before we jump in and to introduce the interim police chief. Many of you, I'm sure, know her already, but welcome, Chief Jacqueline Seabrooks. And she began her public safety career at the age of 19 when she joined the California State Police Division's LA office. She later transferred to the Santa Monica Police Department, where she spent 25 years. In 2007, Chief Seabrooks was appointed as the Chief of Police for the city of Inglewood. In 2012 to 2017, she returned to the Santa Monica Police Department to serve as the 16th Chief of Police. As many of you know, on October 26, 2020, Chief Seabrooks once again returned to our city as the interim Chief of Police. So thank you so much for being here and for really having the tough conversation, and we really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to share some insights, the lessons learned, and to answer questions from the community. I believe the community is entitled to receive that. We're obligated to provide it, even as I want to champion what has gone heretofore unsaid about the wonderful work that the men and women of the Santa Monica Police Department do on the routine basis.
Thank you. And so for anyone who has not seen the report or who would like to have access to the documents while we talk, we have put the link into the chat. And so if you have any questions or anything as well while we go, please let me know. We're going to try to work them in as we go. The only other thing I'll say is I know there's still a lot of emotions around what happened. And so I just ask that everyone, really try to stay respectful. And we're really hoping that we can really come together and figure out, how we move forward as a community and be stronger. So, Chief, to start it off, I just would love to give you the platform and to help us just understand why you thought it was important to have this town hall and really what's the message that you want to share with our community.
Okay. Well, before I get too far into it today, I wanted to be sure that our audience knew that we do have an interpreter available to provide Spanish language translations for questions or for information that is provided. We won't be doing real-time translation just because of some logistical challenges with it, but to the best of our ability, we want to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible with respect to sharing this information in Spanish. Now, having said that, I think the message today that I'd like to get out to our community is one of reconciliation, one of healing, as we begin to move forward along our path away from the events of last year and into our future. I don't think it's lost on anyone in the police department the underlying circumstances, the death of Mr. George Floyd, that gave rise to aspects of last year's actions here in the city. We were all horrified by that. We all continue to be horrified by that. But even as there were protests in solidarity with the Floyd family, and there was unity around the issue of the obligation to stamp out police brutality, even as that was happening, there were those individuals who took advantage of the moment to engage in criminality. And it is at that intersection where peaceful protests and those who are focused on bringing havoc to our community, where they intersected. And it's from that space that the Santa Monica Police Department was involved in quite a bit of learning, quite a bit of coming to grips with what happened. Also, we hurt as well as our community did, and that required that we came to understand what exactly happened here, because our pain was a shared pain with the community. We want to, convey to a community that we understand that our response did not engender, that initial response in those early hours did not engender a level of confidence in this organization. And I want to assure you, as the interim chief, as your former chief, and as a person who's spent the vast majority of my adult life in this city, I want to assure you that we've learned from that. We're sorry that is what came to be. And now it's important that we share the lessons that we've learned, the things that we've put into place, that you can have confidence in moving forward that your police organization is going to be able to address the situation in a way that you can get behind and support. And that's the message today.
Thank you. I want to turn quickly to the 19-page document that you put together, and I don't know if everyone on the call has had a chance to review it or not, and so wanted to just help people understand in that 19-page document, what you did is you added a status. So after you read each one, someone can see, is this implemented? Is it in progress? Is it ongoing? So I wanted to start there because approximately 80%, if I did the math correctly, or even more, have been implemented. So I wanted you to just talk to us about this. What does that mean? If you can kind of share, some things are ongoing, some things are training issues. So just help us understand this document. Also, I think it's important to know that, starting on June 1st, you were already right away working on stuff. And so just kind of give us an overview before we jump into some of the specifics.
Of course. I think it's important for us to understand what gave rise to this document. So we had the unrest. There was internal back and forth about our ability as an organization to provide the kind of after-action assessment that was warranted. And that's an objective look at what went well and what did not. And then really focus in with laser-like intensity on what did not go well and come up with a plan of action for how we begin to address those issues. So the OIR's report was that objective rendering of fact once we got beyond what the police department's leadership at that time did not do. Then the OIR makes this group of recommendations, 44 of which are in the initial report. And then in that, I believe it was number 43, requested that we then prepare a report that shows what we've been doing. Well, I want to be real clear. The police department's initial response to last year's unrest, the first 8 to 10 hours, were not what we would ordinarily equate with our best performance. But we knew moving forward from about hour number 10 that there were things that didn't go well, and that's where the learning and that's where the commitment to change started. It didn't start with the OIR report being produced 90 days ago or so. It started on the late night on the 31st, but in earnest on June 1st. And so this 19-page document takes a look at those recommendations. It sets forth that we accept the recommendations, we accept the report. We may have issue with some of the methodology and who was spoken to and who wasn't, but at the end of the day, what I have emphasized within the organization and within the community is that the focus is on the recommendation. If the recommendation is one that holds water, meaning it's valid, it's something that we looked at or we needed to look at or we did look at or we just knew intuitively that something needed to be different, we have to accept it. And we did. And then we have to be open about and responsive about, and what did we do? It's one thing to accept it, but what course of action did we take? So we wanted to lay out what course of action we took vis-a-vis each of those recommendations. We even reported on those recommendations that were not solely within the purview of the police department to control. We reported on those things. In one of the recommendations is the status is indicated as neutral because we accepted the idea, the underlying idea of the recommendation, and this has to do, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, this has to do with the National Guard response. So we agreed with the theoretical suggestion, but the framework for addressing the problem is one that is beyond the scope of the city because it's determined by the county and the state. But nevertheless, we wanted people to know that, no, we didn't ignore it. We saw it. We acknowledge it. We did some work toward it, but we can't take a position on it because it's out of our hands. So we wanted the community to be clear that we understood the gravity of the report, its recommendations, and our commitment and our ethical obligation to respond and incorporate those responses in our day-to-day activities. And that's what the essence of that report does.
Great, very helpful. And for anyone on the call who has not looked at that, I really encourage you to look at it. We just have put a link to the 19-page document as well, so you can take a look at that as we go. So one of the things, I'd like to start with leadership. I think kind of everything starts with leadership at the top. And so in the report, there were some findings in the report, talked about, the department's internal dynamics, particularly at the command level, were strained in early 2020 in ways that were, negatively influenced the response. It also references turnover at the highest levels, which resulted in members who lacked tenure and were out of sync with the chief. A separate finding, obviously, as you know, that the chief was out of town until the morning of May 31st. And so I don't want to rehash the details because that's not the point of what we're trying to do here, but I think we do need to touch on just really some of these factors and maybe touch on that. Some of those things, but then also I want to have you talk about what were some of the practices that have been put in place. For example, recommendation number 2, your response, you talk about you now have a policy when the police chief is out of town. So talk to us a little bit about what is done. I think this also helps restore trust, restore confidence.
Sure. For many people who are familiar with the police department's operations, but more importantly for those who are not, this police department does not go through a lot of turnover. This is a department where our members come and they typically stay for 15 to 20 years. When we have new leadership, it's not unusual for there to be a level of turnover. But I have to say the leadership, when there was a transition from my administration to the previous administration, not now, but back then, there was an exodus of some of our more senior personnel, and many of them have gone on to head other police organizations. So what that did is that left the organization with new executive leadership, both at the chief level and at the next 2 levels of command, deputy chief and captain. But what I want to address is the misnomer that these people lack tenure. They all have been here upwards of 20 years. Now, they may have been new in their new role, and I think that that bears noting, but at the end of the day, they are experienced members of the police organization across a variety of different police disciplines. Now, when we have a critical incident such as the unrest of last year, it is the responsibility of the police chief to ensure that the deployment of the resources that we have on hand to address the array of challenges that unrest brings, that those resources are sufficient. And unfortunately, because of perhaps misunderstandings of the intelligence, a misreading of the intelligence, or a downplaying of the intelligence, that wasn't, the skill set of our existing staffing wasn't maximized. And because of that, we had a breakdown at the highest levels, and then we're behind the 8 ball consistently in terms of trying to catch up to a situation that's rapidly changing. And so it becomes this series of cascading challenges when the staffing levels are imbalanced in the beginning. And that imbalance was likely the result of a chief fairly new to the community herself, addressing a fairly new executive leadership team on the issues of relevance. And then comes in the, how do we weigh the information? What do we do with it? And where does it go? So I really want to emphasize and get us away from the conversation that my executive team is not experienced, because I have that same team with me currently, serving as my deputy chief and my captains. And I find in the circumstances that we have since prepared for, they've been more than aptly capable and competent in helping to prepare for those events. Luckily, nothing has occurred, but I think that that's because we've been well prepared and focused using the template of what didn't go well last year to inform us as we approach things this year.
Thank you for clarifying that. Is there I don't want to harp too much on leadership, but it also talked about a mistake that the police chief sent to captains, and do you want to comment further on that? And there was some confusion, kind of who was making the decisions, the command post. I just want to give you an opportunity if you want to address that any further, and then we'll move on from leadership.
Okay, well, I think it's important that I address it from the standpoint of who is at the command post. Currently on this call, and to be heard from, I'm assuming a little bit later as we get more in depth in this, is Dr. Joseph Cortez. He's a retired police lieutenant, and he was the incident commander in those early hours of May 31st. And I have to say that he did a very apt job at stepping in and handling this. And the only thing I will say about the chief's decision, it was an unusual decision, as is noted in the report, because you want your executive leadership team to be with you helping to do other more executive leadership functions. By the chief's decision, what she did was turned 2 executive staff members into boots on the ground officers, and then they got sucked into problems and addressing problems in the field, and that was a brain trust that she did not have available to her during the dynamics of the unrest, where the chief needs those folks on hand to be able to provide context and insight to the unfolding situations, not out doing the work of our line level folks at that point in time. So while it was a very unusual decision, the 2 captains did what one would expect captains directed by the police chief to do, and that is to carry out a lawful order, even though flawed, in furtherance of community safety, and that's what they did, and I'm proud of them for it.
Good, thank you for clarifying. Let's talk a little bit about recommendation number 3 and 4 refers to written protocols to ensure that operations plan is developed in advance of potential crowd control situations and a designated incident commander for special operations. You've made changes to the operational planning process from what I've read, and I wanted to see, can you discuss some of these in a little bit greater detail in terms of how it would improve the process?
Sure. I want to be careful that we don't give away company secrets, but I also want to make sure that I am sharing information that allows people to have a level of confidence in what we do. And that is that when information comes in, information can come in as intelligence. It can come in from a post, something as simple as a posting on Nextdoor or social media. It can come in the form of officer observations. And it's important for us to receive that information and process it in the context of what's the impact of this potential information to the city of Santa Monica and over what timeline. And then from there to ensure that we where we determine that there is an impact, either in the short, medium, or long range, that we develop the appropriate response plans. So that means that we have to have people who are constantly culling the environment for intelligence, which we did have the day before and that evening. The breakdowns were in what happened to the information when it was forwarded. And the young lady who was at the centerpiece of that, Miss Maisha Morrison, is on this call this evening as well, and I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to hear from her at a subsequent time. But I think it's important that we understand that that information then gets vetted, and then that becomes the basis coupled with other observations for what we call pre-incident or operational planning. And then the operational planning component has a staffing component, a functional component in terms of what's the mission? What are we going to do when we get all these people, we bring them to the station with the idea of deploying them to address a particularized concern. Here's what the intelligence gives us, and intelligence is this little spotty, amorphous thing. It doesn't come in and say, hey, Santa Monica Police, at this date, on this time, this is going to happen, therefore you need. It may be just a kind of a fleeting posting on TikTok. It might be another fleeting posting on some other social media platform. And it's up to us to connect the dots. So what we had that evening, before 5:31 on 5:30, we had experiences that our staff had assisting the Beverly Hills Police Department. We had a sense of fleeting information coming across social media. Some of that information we were able to vet and determine that maybe this isn't what it is, but out of an abundance of caution, we're going to treat it like it's something else. And for that information that we couldn't completely vet, meaning we couldn't find who posted it, what their intents were, we couldn't reach out to anybody. We had to treat that information as though it was going to move forward. And then from there, what you do is you create a plan. How many people do you need? Where do you need them? What will they be doing in these particular points? What contingencies have you built into the system? So that's what operational planning entails. It also has a plan for demobilization, for equipment that we'll utilize in the worst case scenario, and where we will have that, and if we don't need it, how long will we have it for? And so it's really just the ability to look at all of the opportunities, all of the threats, all of the existing strengths, and make sure that that is in a cohesive plan that can be readily communicated to people who are coming in the next day and going to work. And what we've done is we've tightened the intelligence function, and by tightening the intelligence function, we've also strengthened pre-existing reporting processes and procedures. It's made us take a look at how far down in the organization do we do this type of planning? How far down in the organization do we require our staff to be trained? Are we consistently training on this particular issue? And so we took a look at all of that as part and parcel of preparing our response, but not just preparing our response, but looking at and critically examining the response of last year for the learning opportunities that we could then implement moving forward.
Thank you. I want to ask you a question moving kind of some of the losses to the businesses, and then also after this, I thought it could be helpful to hear from some of your team about a little bit more about what was going on that day, just to kind of get different perspectives, because I think it was traumatic for really all of us. So first, just starting, on a good note, we didn't lose any lives. And if we had lost lives, that would have been a whole different conversation. And so obviously we had, with the vandalism and property damage, no one wants that. Losses to businesses were devastating. The business community was very upset, which we understand. And so, if you're a small business owner and you lost all of your inventory and your business was seriously damaged, and it's heartbreaking and it's devastating. And so as we, it's difficult, right? We're trying to obviously protect human life. We're trying to protect businesses. We're trying to weigh our resources, our budget issues, the well-being of all. Can you just help us understand all of those things, and how do we look at that? Because I know you want to protect everyone, but there were so many events going on that day. Can you just talk to that a little bit, because it's a very difficult situation?
It absolutely is, and it is a no-win situation, quite honestly, for the police. I often share the comment when I first came back to work as the interim chief. someone said to me, well, Chief, the least you could have done was had your officers shooting looters. And I was mortified, absolutely mortified. It's an illegal, unconstitutional, horrific, inhumane response. And I couldn't believe someone would actually say that in a forum where other people heard it. I'm not just making it up. The person wasn't talking to me over coffee. And so, so if the police had done that, we would have a horrifying conversation happening now. We're having a conversation now that, while unpleasant because of the recognition, the clear recognition that we let down our community, and we're sorry for that. They had an expectation that we would do certain things, and because of decisions that were made, we didn't meet that expectation. And for that, that's the essence, that's the difficulty. But equally, and while we stand again, when we champion the fact that nobody was seriously injured and nobody was killed, there are those people who say, well, that's the measure. And I say, well, it's a measure. It's one of several measures. So I also say, that it's unfortunate that we did not have the opportunity to establish publicly what our priorities are during a course of unrest. And in my return, when we were expecting unrest associated with various events that were happening in the larger environment, i.e., the election, around the electoral college component, around the January 6th issue, around the trial associated with the Minneapolis police officer, former Minneapolis police officer. When we looked at that, I sent out a series of public safety messages that focused on what our priorities would be. And it's always life safety first and foremost. And that's whether the person is engaging in protected speech or they're out there looting and the like. We have to protect without prejudice. So we do that. And then we turn our attention to how can we maintain civil order? What does that look like? That means hopefully we keep looting, arson and crimes like that have the tendency to rip apart the social fabric of a city. We keep that to a dull roar. And then lastly, we look to protect property. And so what that means, and I always analogize it to a conversation I heard the Baltimore city mayor having in the aftermath of their unrest, in the aftermath of the Freddie Gray death at the hands of the Baltimore police, when she said, you have to understand that there's going to be a degree of looting, because there's never enough police to address every single looter who comes into the community, because to do that, you do it at the peril of things like life safety, and you also do it at the risk of getting civil order and control. So while I empathize wholeheartedly with those whose businesses were adversely affected, and I empathize in ways that you couldn't possibly imagine, on the other hand, I'm happy that no one lost their lives. I'm happy that, to the degree that we were able to, arsons and things that tear at the fabric of a community, they were at minimum. So they did happen, we understand, and yes, a lot of looting happened. Everybody saw it. But that, while terrible, it's a what they call it, a Faustian choice. I'd rather have that than to have the violence and the tearing of the fabric where you look at a community and you just go, wow, that's a devastating loss. And if you look around the country, you see a lot of that. That didn't happen to that degree here, but it did happen, and for that we have to be accountable. And through this process, we are being accountable.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's important to also note that the 117-page report also noted that counties all through LA and over the country had similar issues. Doesn't mean it's okay, but it wasn't only happening here. I just want to note that. So,
if you don't mind, I'd like to say one thing on that. Equally, in a lot of those communities that engaged in after-action reporting, the issues with respect to the public safety response in those communities, when you distill it down to the core issues, they were very similar. They spoke to issues of resource management, equipment, and people. They spoke to the organized bands of looters. They spoke to things like that. So there were some common threads that affected all of the responding police agencies as well. And that's not just the 224 men and women that make up the sworn element of the Santa Monica Police Department, coupled with another 260 civilian professional staff. We're talking agencies the size of Chicago, the Los Angeles Police Department, et cetera. So we're also talking larger size agencies that also dealt with this problem, that also have the same types of issues, even though their resource pool starts off at 5, 10, 15 times the size of ours.
Thank you for clarifying. One quick question that I want to bring in from the chat. Is there anything that residents could have done to assist on May 31st? Is there anything that we need to be thinking about? Any comment on that?
Well, I think residents could do, at a point, you help your neighbor. You don't contribute to the problem inadvertently by coming out thinking that there's something that you can do. Because either A, you get sucked into a problem innocently, or, people might think that, sometimes people come out with this idea that they're going to do something, and that borders on vigilantism, and we can't have that either. So, and then where that becomes apparent, that's another problem that the police department has to manage. So sometimes the best thing that you can do is to stay in your home, reach out to the people that you know, share insights and information and be a basis of support. And then in the aftermath of things like this, extend a bit of grace to those first responders who put their lives at risk in trying to resolve what essentially is an untenable kind of problem.
Right, and you should not be an opportunistic looter like we saw, not appropriate. But someone could take a picture, could take a video, which could be helpful after fact, something like that. But
we had people in the community who did that and submitted video to us. Some were horrified and said, "I saw this is what my neighbor was doing," and we actually followed up with post-investigative or with post-incident investigative action and prosecution. So there is that ability to be that passive witness who's out there, who's giving us the information that we need to follow up later. Because what I don't want people to presume is that the looters got away scot-free. We did a lot of investigative time in a task force environment, and also independent of the task force, to ensure that as many people as we could were brought to justice and property was recovered and returned to its rightful owners. And we were able to do some of that for a number of people.
Good. There's one comment in the chat. Are you interested in returning to lead the Santa Monica Police Department on a more permanent basis? We can save that. I don't know if you want to comment, but I saw that.
I'll comment because I get it a lot. I'm going to tell you, I love the city and I love the men and women of this police department because I know what they're capable of doing under the best of circumstances. I think my challenge is I've already retired. I don't even live in the state of California anymore. And when my family, quote unquote, the city of Santa Monica, direct and extended, asked me, it took me a while to say yes, I would come back, but I did. But I'm not willing to come out of retirement on a permanent basis because I think I've more than earned it up after what's now almost 40 years of service. But I appreciate and feel humbled by the thought that folks think I should.
So one of the report, it discussed talking to about 15 representatives from the Santa Monica Police Department who shared, a theme of regret and having wanted to do more, of course, that day. In the report, it also notes that on an average day, the 911 dispatch team handles about 300 to 350 calls. May 31st, it was 12 times that many, with some individual hours reaching a call volume of 600. There were also many times an officer heard a 10-3 code 3, if I'm saying that correctly, which means an officer needs help. I thought it might be helpful to have one or two people from your team just talk to us a little bit about what that feels like. Give us a little bit of an expanded perspective and what was going on from their perspective.
Okay. Because I haven't been in the field, boots on the ground, in quite a while, other than the odd occasion here and there, I don't think it's appropriate for me to take that on, particularly since I wasn't here during the seminal period that we're talking about. So I want to turn it over to Sergeant Gerardo Leyva for a few minutes for him to share some insights about what that is, what that meant, and then after Sergeant Leyva speaks, I'd like for Lieutenant Rudy Flores, who was also boots on the ground out in the community on that day, to give some commentary to that. Sergeant Leyva?
Yes, hi, Chief. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Gerardo Leyva. I am a sergeant with the Santa Monica Police Department. I've been with the city of Santa Monica since September of 1992. I worked a variety of capacities. I'm also the current POA chairman or president of our union. I've worked a variety of assignments within my almost 30-year career here with the police department. One thing I like to talk about, and Elisa, you touched on it a little bit, when an officer, requests help, one of the highest degrees of help that we can request is a 10-3 Code 3, which is a short-term or short code of saying, officer needs help, get here as fast as you can, drop whatever you're doing, which is not very common in our city. We rarely get those requests. If you were to listen to just a few minutes of May 31st, you heard that over and over, 10-3 Code 3 with the location where we're at. And when you hear that on a normal day, everybody goes there. I mean, including the chief. She'll drop what she's doing. She'll go to wherever that request is because you need help. You're not able to contain or you're under duress and your life's in danger. Well, on that day, there were numerous 10-3 Code 3s, and many officers felt abandoned because they were at, named the intersection, and nobody could respond to their 10-3 Code 3 because everybody that was out there was dealing with their own 10-3 Code 3. It was complete chaos with every officer that was out there. And so now we're finding that a lot of them are dealing with this trauma, like they let someone down and then they were let down. And many of us have built very unique friendships and ties with our community because we don't see ourselves as just we're here to provide a service and we're gone to our homes somewhere else. It's been ingrained in us since I've been even as a police cadet in '92 that we are part of the community. We are the community. A lot of us, like myself and Lieutenant Flores, I was born and raised in Santa Monica, went to school in Santa Monica. My parents were products of Santa Monica, working at businesses like American Appliance, Paper Mate. And so though I don't live in the city, we feel very connected with our residents in our community. And so to that degree, there's still that feeling that we let our community down. And on a personal note, there's a friend of mine who owns a small business in Santa Monica. She must have called me, 15 times that day asking for help because her business was in the process of being looted, and I couldn't get to her. There was a tremendous amount of guilt that, to some degree I still have, knowing that even though I know I couldn't do anything because, we're dealing with other things, that I let a friend down and I let a business owner down. And her business was completely devastated. And so, we're a lot, not just me, in talking to a lot of our officers, they're feeling that guilt and that resentment, like I couldn't do anything to help on that particular day. And, we're seeing that, and that's been surfacing for the last year with our officers. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with from our end, is having to accept the fact that we failed. We're not used to failing. If somebody calls us, we try to go over there and fix the problem to the best of our ability, and we couldn't on that day. And so we're having to deal with that. And it goes not just to our officers, but to our civilian or our professional staff that found themselves in the middle of May 31st, and they couldn't do anything to stop or prevent any looting. And we all know that, those looters those were not members of our community. That was from the outside. So we're very well aware that we're not blaming our community. We know very well it wasn't our community. And so that's what we're having to deal with. Rudy, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that too. We really appreciate that. Yeah, Rudy, did you want to add? So let me ask you. Oh, Rudy. So
Yeah. Hi, thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Lissa. So my name is Rudy Flores. I'm currently a lieutenant here at the Santa Monica Police Department. I, like Jerry, started with the department in 1992. Started as a young cadet at 18, was a communications operator, and became an officer about 24 years ago or so. Like Jerry, I also grew up here in the West Side. My entire family is basically in Santa Monica, Venice, Culver City, Inglewood, and West Los Angeles. I live just outside of the city. In about a month or so, my kids are going to start school here in Santa Monica. My wife works here in Santa Monica. We are in Santa Monica all the time. This is my community. This is our community. And so, and I say that because there's a lot of people, a lot of personnel here within the department who have a very similar story. And besides that, you know, those who are new to the area, or are new officers, or new employees here, they've adopted that philosophy and what that Jerry just mentioned. You know, we are part of the community. The community is part of us. And, you know, we truly believe that. But last year was hard. It was very, very difficult, as Jerry just mentioned, kind of going back to before 5/31. If everyone can remember just the overall anxiety, the fear, the uncertainty of what was going on because of the pandemic, if this was something new to everyone, and obviously not just here in Santa Monica, throughout the nation, throughout the world, right? And so everybody was told to go home. We didn't. We didn't go home. None of us went home. And trust me, that fear, that uncertainty, that was here as well amongst all of us, and not knowing what was going to happen to us. Our families were scared. We were going home. We were sleeping in different rooms. Some of us were sleeping in the cars or even in the garage just because we didn't necessarily know. And during that time, I remember that our community, you know, the downtown area community, responded, and they saw that and they noticed it. And it was a great time when they were sending us food. They were sending us drinks and like danishes and cards and PPE equipment. And you know, it was, we felt as far as we were part of the community. And so, and all of a sudden an incident occurred thousands of miles away, you know, and we were all in shock, and we were all devastated. We were all angry at what we saw. And I remember when we would talk in briefings or other meetings here, we were just like, I cannot believe that happened. God, that would never happen here in Santa Monica. And then things changed. And you didn't feel like you were part of the community. And you were painted with this broad brush. And it was like you, us, you. And of course, the civil unrest occurred here in our city, and that definitely did not help. But the reason why we had the issues that we had is there was a decision obviously made at the highest level, and we were playing catch up. And you had pretty much, if not most, if not all of the officers and professional staff, they self-deployed, they came in, and they did an overall phenomenal job. But it was still so very difficult because it was just devastating to see your city, you know, being destroyed. And there was very little that you can do at the time. And it feels like, someone breaks into your house, you know, and you come in and it's ransacked, and, you know, and there's nothing necessarily you can do. And that's what we felt. And we did feel, like Jerry said, you know, we felt like we let down the community, that community that was trying to support us, that was sending us food, that was sending us drinks. And so it was just an overall very difficult day for us. But I do want to say this, before someone else speaks, is that, you know, prior to that day, I counted that we had about 7 different protests here in the city. And then after June 1st, we've had several protests after that, large ones as well, that we helped to facilitate. So, when we're prepared, when we have the necessary information in place, yes, we do things right. And I think it's important that the community in Santa Monica know that you have a professional, well-trained, caring police department who really does care a lot about their community, and it is their community.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Lisa, I'd just like to add one more thing, if I may. And Rudy touched on it, how, that our problems came really, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it came from the very top. And what I've told our community members is I'm a golf, well, I play golf. I'm not very good at it. But the analogy I like to tell people is it's like playing at a golf tournament and being told, here, use this, the 7-iron and this used ball and go win the tournament. We weren't given enough time to prepare. And our officers that were out there, they did a phenomenal job for what they had, and for the resources and the planning that we had. All officers, our line officers, did a tremendous, phenomenal job. A lot of them self-deployed, came in and just went to wherever they thought they were needed without going to the station and looking for other equipment. They were looking for equipment that was going to protect themselves, like shields, helmets, equipment of that nature, and not necessarily worried about some of the other things like body-worn cameras. And I know that's been touched upon in the OIR report, but our officers were more concerned about getting to a scene and helping the fellow officers, because they were hearing they're watching the news, and friends were calling them saying, hey, are you watching what's going on at so-and-so location? Some officers were like, oh no, I didn't even know, and they self-deployed because they knew they needed the help. And so, to Rudy's point, our officers did a phenomenal job for what they had.
Chief, did you want to add? There's a couple questions that I wanted to bring in from the chat, but I wanted to just give you, maybe a few, to see, did you want to add anything or share anything else?
Well, as I'm listening to both Sergeant Flores and also Lieutenant Flores and Sergeant Leyva, I need, for the sentiment that they've expressed, as well as the insights that they've shared, to kind of resonate a bit. But realizing too that in doing that, we do have time. I was looking at the chat as well, and I wanted to make sure that there were a couple of things that we did take the time to address.
Yeah.
And one of the questions that I saw was someone asked about lawsuits.
Before we go there, I just want to thank the both officers, just because I know it's really hard to speak and to go to share that again. But I think the one takeaway that I have also is that it is not us against you. It is together, and they have a perspective. They were running into this, and so I think it's very easy just to be like, well, why didn't they do this, and why didn't they do this? And so I think it's really helpful just to understand what it really felt like and what was actually going on, and really how difficult it was on all levels. So I just wanted to acknowledge them and thank them for sharing, because I know it's tough.
And I do want to say, in adding to that, we have been emphasizing wellness and well-being significantly since that time, but most pointedly this year at the 1-year mark, so that we could be sure that as folks hit that 1-year period of reflection, that we as an organization are responding to embrace them with the kind of well-being services that they need, and there has definitely been a spike in the need for those services, because I do think that there's a sense of responsibility, failed responsibility. I do think that there's a sense of pain and sorrow at not being what we know we can be and doing what we know we should do and could do, but because of resource shortages and deficits and decisions that were made, that didn't get done. And so we've got to reconcile that. And that's also part of the internal reconciliation and healing work that we're doing, even as I'm hoping that this conversation will promote some of that with the community as it relates to us and the community.
Good, good. So I know you want to get to one of the questions you were starting on that, but I want to say, Gerardo, Jerry mentioned the body cams, and so there is a question about the body cams, talking about how can we reconciliate as a community when there was no accountability for the large number of police who did not turn on their cameras. So can you just speak to that? I think Jerry actually did speak to it a little bit, but maybe give us a little bit more insight, and then we can talk about the lawsuits and the text message, the text.
Of course. And I think it's important for us to realize, when we talk about a large number of the officers didn't have their cameras on, a large number of them also did. So I think what we have to look at is, I don't know at what time the OIR looked at who was doing what with respect to the cameras. But let me be clear, cameras are not a panacea for everything. They provide a supplemental set of eyes, if you will, to look at particular circumstances. But those cameras are a technology, and nothing is fail-safe, or there's always going to be some, or I should say fail-proof. There's always going to be some challenge. Some of these officers at points in time were out for 15, 16, 18 hours. We don't have a camera, and there's not a camera that's made that's going to have a battery life that goes that far. And so that presents a challenge, particularly since the units are self-contained, and you now need to put the unit in a charger for the system to charge. So if you're out on foot and you're addressing, a series of ongoing problems, it's not going to work for 18 hours. Our shifts are 12 hours. And even in that, the cameras aren't on all the time. Some of the officers turned on the cameras when the situation looked like it was going to move from just something peaceful and seemingly routine into something where the dynamic required, in accord with policy, that they turn the cameras on. Some officers did, in fact, do that. Now, I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that some officers didn't, because we clearly know that some officers didn't have cameras turned on, and others didn't have cameras because they came from somewhere, and you heard the sergeant say, they self-deployed. So what that means is they came in, threw on some clothes and went out, or they didn't even come in, they went to where they understood the command post to be at the bus garage, and then self-deployed from there, or just self-deployed to a particular location because they heard that there was something happening. So some of those people actually went out in the field with no camera at all. So you have people who have no camera at all. You have some people who didn't turn on the cameras when they should have. I'm going to be clear about that, and I'll talk about and what happens to them. And then we had those folks who had cameras, but whose cameras failed over time because the amount of time that they were out. Because we do have a lot of body-worn footage. Now, what the OIR looked at in totality, I don't really know. They took a random sampling, and then from there, made their extrapolations. So there is that. Now, what did we learn from that? What we learned from that is a couple of things. We're working with, we've now got a computer camera system that now, if you're within 30 feet of somebody else, it activates their cameras. So that's an opportunity to utilize the technology in a way that it creates a redundancy feature. If you're in close proximity to a vehicle, it may activate the in-vehicle camera. That's another redundancy. The battery life is a little bit extended. Is it going to give us 18 hours of coverage continuous? No, but we can do things to try to maximize the coverage under those kinds of circumstances. Okay, so that's happening. We reiterate the policy. We mentioned earlier that we have the the operational planning documents that we put together. We reiterate not just in those documents, but in the routine activities on a daily basis, the importance of adhering to the body-worn camera policy, which is when you move to an enforcement posture, you turn the camera on. We'll evaluate whether or not we want to have it running continuously, but there's some problems with that. And it means if you have it running continuously, the battery life isn't going to give you what you need for a 12-hour shift. So we have to work within the parameters of the limitations of the technology. And we have I think it's the body-worn camera 3, which is for our vendor is the most recent iteration of that camera system. So we're looking at ways to ensure that we build in redundancies. We're looking at ways to be sure that we get the most out of our battery life for what is essentially an integrated camera battery. So it's not like you pull it off and go plug it in. It's more like a cell phone, so you plug in the whole unit. Well, if you need it in the field, we don't have 500 of those things. We issue one to each employee. So therein lies, some challenges there. And then where we find that there is willful non-compliance with policy, we address that through the disciplinary process. It's a confidential process, so I'm not going to be able to talk about how many employees did we identify, who were they. What I can tell you is when we became aware of that problem, we undertook the appropriate corrective action to bring it to people's attention, as one would expect would be done in an organization that is committed to accountability. And I can't say more than that because specifics about personnel matters are confidential. They're protected pursuant to the Peace Officers' Bill of Rights, and that's a whole other conversation. However, I just want people to know that we did take action. So
I think that's fair. I think that's a fair response, and we have a lot of questions, so let's keep moving on to some other stuff because I think that's fair, and it sounds like you've taken action, and we'll continue to do what we think is appropriate. So. You were going to touch base. There was a quick question. Have there been any lawsuits? And there was also a question about the former chief perhaps not saving some of the text messages that were supposed to be in compliance with the state law. We have other questions, but I would just like to touch on these because I really appreciate people putting in questions to the chat.
Yes, lawsuits have been filed. Black Lives Matter, and I believe also in conjunction with the ACLU, has filed a class action lawsuit against this city as well as several other cities wherein unrest occurred. And it's a pending litigation matter, so I really don't have more comment other than that. That's what they've done. And we'll take a look at what that is, what comes out of that litigation. And certainly if there are additional learning points to implement, as we always do, we'll implement them accordingly. But that is one of the newer developments. I understand that there's the potential for other litigation. And then we've had individuals come forward and file claims against the city, pending the city's decisions about how they're going to handle that, for loss, damaged properties, or loss or damaged property, as well as for, I won't say minor injuries, but injuries sustained during the course of the unrest, but as a direct result of an engagement with an officer from either this department or another department. So we have had that occur. And where there's, as I said, where there's points of learning that come out of that litigation, or as a result of any settlements, if we learn anything that will be of value, that would be beneficial for us to incorporate within our operational policies, we'll do exactly that. Talked about the body-worn cameras. Yeah. Someone did ask a side note that I do want to address real quick about the COVID vaccinations.
Yes.
While unrelated, I think it's important because it does speak to staffing issues in a generalized sense. So consistent with what you see in the county, about 50 to 55% of the police organization has undergone vaccinations. Some of our staff has religious objections and or medical exemptions that would preclude it. The city is looking at evaluating, as other cities are implementing, mandatory vaccinations or mandatory testing in the absence of those. We will see how those things come through, but our officers, those who originally, and our professional staff, those who originally wanted to, in conjunction with the local hospital, we were able to get that done well ahead of when the county would have routinely made those vaccinations available to our first response personnel. So our fire department and our police department and our office of emergency management, we were all able to coordinate what we needed to do, and I was able to get what I needed for staff here. And that's kind of where the facts of that are at this particular point. And then as to the question on violent crime, crime is up 7% in the community this year. However, I do have to make a comment that when we look at crime relative to 2018 and 2019, 2021 year-to-date figures are trending lower than both 2018 and 2019. 2020 was a different year because it was either artificially high because of what happened around the period of 5/31, or it was artificially low because over the time there was a lockdown for a significant part of that time. So it's important to let you know that this community is relatively safe overall, although I do get that there is a concern about quality of life issues associated around homelessness and the like that make people feel less than safe, and the police department is evaluating mechanisms and methods to be able to address that in a consistently holistic way.
Thank you. And that could even be a thing to do something separate on that topic as well.
I'm here for it.
So let's, great questions. Thank you all. We really appreciate it. Let's talk a little bit about intelligence gathering leading into the National Guard, but also for some businesses. I think some people were upset that, as the George Floyd protest began to grow, there were some things in Beverly Hills. Some people were obviously frustrated with our preparedness on Saturday and Sunday. We've obviously talked about this. So I want you to comment on some of the intelligence that we were getting, and I know we can't go into anything that's private, obviously, but I think we also there have been changes as well to the intelligence gathering, so perhaps speak to that. I think there's also questions around what happened with the National Guard. So I think it would be helpful for us to understand everything that needs to be done before the National Guard can be called. Obviously, there was a delay there, but then the last part of this question, if you can remember all of this, is, why weren't some businesses warned? It is a little confusing, and, leading into that, should anyone, when you see some of these things happen with the banks, I think sometimes people are frustrated because the CEO is not held accountable, right? And so it's kind of like, who is held accountable with this? And so I put that question to you, kind of starting with intelligence gathering. Is it someone at the highest level, or, what have we done about that? And so can you maybe just address that? Because that is part of some of the frustration as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to work backwards because I think it makes more sense, and then I want to spend a little bit more time on the intelligence gathering component, and I have one of our staff members on who I think can also talk a bit about some of the work that was done around that associated with 531. So we ask ourselves, where does accountability lie? And I will tell you, it rested at the highest levels. How do I know? Because I was in retirement on May 31st, and I'm not right now. And we have a search ongoing for a new police chief. So accountability at its highest level was exacted. And that's all I can say. I know, it's not easy for a police chief to recover following unrest in a community. Is it possible? Yes. Was this the appropriate response? It's not for me to decide. The city decided. The city believed it needed to move in a new direction, and it needed some space and time within which to do that. And they brought me back just to stabilize things and to see to it that we move forward from what was a dark period. So that's where it is, and I leave it at that to say that my presence being here shows that accountability at the highest level and where the decisions rested. And you heard the sergeant say, decisions made from up top. Well, it didn't get any higher than the role of the chief of police. So the chief of police is where the accountability was exacted from, and that's the space that we're in now. And as we look ahead, we are a good ways along the pathway toward making a final selection for the next permanent chief for the Santa Monica Police Department. So that would be chief, I believe, number 18, because I'm like 17, 8 sort of. So having said that, I know there was also a question in the chat about whether or not businesses were warned. I don't know that businesses were warned the night before. Some may have known people who, or heard something or gotten wind from a variety of different sources. So I really can't speak to that and whether or not the police department did that part. But as it related to other activities and potential things from the time I got here in the latter part of October looking forward, a lot of the reasons for my public safety communication messaging around those events that I talked about earlier in our conversation, those were specifically designed to serve as that early warning alert, to let people know that they could be boarding up their businesses, that they could be protecting their homes against the possibility that we might face unrest, because we didn't know. We had intelligence, which goes back to the initial part of this. We had intelligence that things could come to the city, could come to the region, but we didn't have anything specific. And intelligence is rarely specific, as I said earlier in our conversation. It comes in these bits and pieces that we have to, as the professionals, connect the dots and then hope that we are getting it right. And so my saying is, cheap policing isn't good and good policing isn't cheap. That means that you look at this intelligence through the lens of what's the worst possible scenario? Okay, well, let's dial it back from there, but let's deploy and make sure we have on hand the resources necessary to assist us in getting through a problem. If it turns out we don't need these resources, it's a heck of a lot easier to send people home when you don't need them than it is to get them here when you needed them a half an hour ago. And our experience of 531 points out the accuracy of that. And my experience with this is not just around 531. It's around the other 9 years of police chiefing experience that I had prior to coming back here. So I do think, it's important for us to know that when we know the information, the police department does have an obligation to share what we know in that way that enables people to make informed decisions about what they're going to do. Because again, as I said earlier, our focus is life safety, civil order maintenance, property protection. So what that means, though, is for the owner, the business owner, the homeowner, they may have to engage in self-help remedies, but what that also means is they have to know the law about self-help. They have to have, make sure that they've hardened their businesses or their residences, depending on where they live. They've hardened them as targets. Did you board up? Have you invested in roll-up doors? Do you know how to work your surveillance cameras? Are they operable? Those kinds of mechanisms and those kinds of measures, so that you act as an assistant tool to us when things go different than we planned. So then we now I turn my attention to the National Guard. I think a lot of people thought that the National Guard was asked for way late because they showed up way late. Well, that's not what happened. What occurred, there has to be there's a protocol for making a request of the National Guard. And the first thing is that you have utilized all available resources within both the municipality and within the mutual aid region. Part of the mutual aid region for the city of Santa Monica, meaning those agencies that come to assist the Santa Monica Police Department when things go beyond the scope of what we can ordinarily handle with our own routine and non-routine staff. That is what we call Area A. That's the UCLA Police Department, it's the Beverly Hills Police Department, and it's the West Hollywood Sheriffs. We also have the ability to call on Culver City, to call on other elements of LAPD and the Sheriff's Department, and those folks did come out at a point, meaning the Sheriff's Department and LAPD. From there, when those resources have been sucked up into trying to resolve the problem, and the problem is still beyond the capacity of those resources to control, the city then, in conjunction with the police department, the Office of Emergency Management Director, the police chief, and generally with the concurrence of the city administrator, city manager, then make a call to the county. And it is through the county that the National Guard resources are requested. Those resources don't come directly to the city. Instead, they come from their rallying points, which for this general region are either in Oxnard or in Los Alamitos, and they go to the Sheriff's Department. It's then incumbent on the Santa Monica Police Department to go out to the Sheriff's Department's Hall of Justice, downtown or in East LA, whichever area they're using, and to escort them back into the city. Unfortunately, that request got held up in some way, shape, or form because that request was made in the early afternoon hours. Keep in mind that things began to go south as early as, 11:30, 12 o'clock. The request was made close to 1 o'clock, 1:30. The National Guard did not show up for 6 to 8 hours, as I understand it, or the evening hours. And when they did show up, they showed up with a contingent of the Sheriff's Department. I have yet to get a clear view as to why, but when we looked at this analytically through the city, what we learned was we did make calls back through the Cal Office of Emergency Services, which is the home agency of the National Guard, to find out, hey, what's the delay? And we were told they've been deployed to the Sheriff's Department for deployment to you. That is the structure that is consistent up and down the state. So our approach at having to deal with the problem in this way is not unusual. The challenge was, we both know, and I'm not going to pull any punches, everybody knows that neither Oxnard nor Los Alamitos are 8 hours away from Santa Monica, no matter how you cut it. Don't care how much traffic there is. It's just not like that. So it appears to me that perhaps the demand on resources of the National Guard, because keep in mind, Santa Monica was not the bubble of only law enforcement asking for this assistance. Long Beach was asking for this assistance. Other cities were asking for this assistance. And so it's very likely that the delay was the result of having to ensure that everybody got a piece of the available resources. And when it got to us, it got to us. And as soon as it got to us, we deployed it as it came to us. Would I have liked it to be sooner? Absolutely. I'm sure everybody would have. Have we tried to work through to ensure that these kinds of delays are minimized moving forward? Absolutely. At every juncture where we have had a critical planning phase, I have reached out to the assistant chief of the Cal OES, California Office of Emergency Services, the home agency of the National Guard, and I've chatted with him directly. I've had him here in my office talking to him about, responsiveness and expectations of the city of Santa Monica under this current administration and moving forward. Does that guarantee anything? No, but sometimes it lets people know, look, this is what happened. We can't have this happening again. And there's been a very strong positive receptivity to those conversations. So I can only hope that in the future, should the need arise, we will have laid the foundation to ensure that both sides of this equation that have the ability to impact this city are fully aware of what their obligations are to us vis-a-vis the National Guard. And then lastly, we want to talk about intelligence gathering. Ms. Maisha Morrison is on the call. She is our crime prevention coordinator, and she assisted us last year in making sense of a lot of the intelligence that was gathered around the period of 5/30 and 5/31. And I know that a lot of that information was in fact passed along, information that from what was occurring and what the officers who assisted Beverly Hills the night before, that information was passed along. But again, a lot of how that information and intelligence was gathered and what happened with it was contingent on how the executive staff processed that information. And at the end of the day, what decisions the police chief made as it related to that information. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And as one can see, individuals were not happy with outcomes. Hence, accountability has been exacted, and you now have a new chief. And certainly, if you'd like to have Ms. Morrison come on, I'm more than happy to turn this over to her if she'd like to answer a few questions about not what intelligence was gathered, but how we do it and how it looks different now that we have computer-based technology to assist us with data mining.
Sure. Let's talk about, some of the high levels. And just for a time check, it's 7:45. This is until 8 o'clock, but we can go an extra 5 or 10 minutes, but we'll, just so everyone can manage their time, So just being mindful of time, maybe a couple minutes to understand that process.
Yes, Ms. Morrison?
Thank you. Just really quickly, my name is Maisha Morrison. I am a crime prevention coordinator with the Santa Monica Police Department. And on May 31st, 2020, my role was actually in transition. So, National Night Out and all those great events and, neighborhood watch meetings, that was my primary concern and my primary role. Prior to 531, when we saw that there was actually an increase in protests surrounding the COVID pandemic and the closures of a lot of the beaches, I was brought in and asked to do a little extra work, which included listening via social media and trying to determine what was going on and if we were potentially going to see a protest in the city of Santa Monica related to COVID. As the trial came to head, we definitely started switching and looking at different things. But I think it's really important for the community to understand is that we had never seen anything on this level in the city of Santa Monica. When we were looking at social media, there were tons of things that are popping up. And as the chief mentioned, there is a difference between information and intelligence. So we would see random posts here or there where someone would say, I'm going to come to Santa Monica and loot. And when you look at those posts, regardless of what social media platform they're posted on, you're looking at how many followers do they have, how many people have retweeted or shared this information. And what we found is that some of the posts were not getting very many looks. There was not a situation where we saw thousands upon thousands of individuals looking at one post. And at the time, I was working this kind of assignment alone. And that's something that is definitely not what we're seeing now in the police department. So I went from where the police department went from just, 2-4 eyes, doing all of the data mining, all of the social media searching to see if there was any threat that was coming into the city. And fast forward, here we are now in 2021, and what we're looking at is a full team that is managed or supervised by 2 sergeants who are fully committed and only focused on events and intelligence and things that are coming into the city. The team is also made up of civilians like myself and some other sworn officers who are very well versed in taking a look at not just Twitter and Instagram, but looking above and beyond TikTok and some of the other things that were not on our radar at the moment of 531. And what we're also seeing is that there are tons of technologies out there, things that we have now been able to tap into in terms of doing some of the legwork ourselves. Instead of simply searching, Twitter for riot or looting, which obviously are not words that someone who is potentially planning to do harm to the city will be using. But instead of just looking for those things manually, we now have software on board that is able to assist with that. And I kind of want to call an audible here. I know that Lieutenant Cortez is here on the call, and he was instrumental in trying to, prior to 531, look at some of the intelligence. The chief mentioned the Hall of Justice, and I know that he was one of our representatives who went to meet with all of these other agencies here or in the local West LA kind of area and looking at where the threat was. And it's unfortunate and it's horrible, but the city of Santa Monica was just not at the top of the list. And he may be able to speak to that. And I think that may have contributed to why there was what some people foresee as a lack of planning on behalf of the Santa Monica Police Department in dealing with the unrest in the city that day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maisha. I hope everyone can hear me. Just to piggyback on what she said, again, my name is Joseph Cortez. I was assigned down to the Hall of Justice in the city of Los Angeles, downtown, with all of the Los Angeles County sheriffs and all the area representatives. At that time, we were specifically data mining for information pertaining to the city of Santa Monica. We had officers deployed out to the city of Beverly Hills. We had information from them that there was concern about keeping it going and taking it to Santa Monica, but that was just information. I relayed that over to the sheriffs. However, they had specific and articulable information that was turned into intelligence that they were going elsewhere in the county. They showed me that information. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of resources were deployed, and that's what kind of took us a little bit by surprise when we weren't at the top of that list of possible locations that would be going further into deployment activities in the next day. I'll leave it there with the time pending and answer any other questions that there are.
Thank you so much. Chief, did you want to add anything, or can I ask you another question?
Yes, I did want to make sure that Dr. Cortez, then Lieutenant Cortez, gets his due, because he was the incident commander during the majority of the events that were unfolding, and his is the voice that one hears, coordinating the resources as they became available, attempting to deploy the resources to address the sheer overwhelming number of calls that were coming in various parts of the city, while ensuring that the response was coordinated and done in a way that didn't create undue harm exposure for the officers. And I think it's important to know that that ordinarily is not a role that a lieutenant under a circumstance like this might do, but keeping in mind that decisions that had been made put him in that position, and he stepped up to the plate. And I'm for one, and I know a number of the men and women of this organization were grateful for that. And then I did want to kind of go back for a nanosecond, because someone mentioned the lawsuits, and I talked a bit about that, and I also wanted to make sure that I connected, because I know some of the lawsuits or the claims that have been filed against the city may involve the conditions that were in our mobile our mobile jail facility. And we have our jail administrator on the call, Jen Estrada, and I want her to give a little treatment to the policy that we implemented immediately on learning that our facility was not adequate to address the issues, and seeing the issues that were at play, what she did about that. And then when we come back, I want to talk a bit about repairing the relationship with the community's youth, talk a little bit about, because I know someone did ask and I didn't forget it, I wrote it down, but didn't get to it, on the violation associated with the text message email exchanges between the captains and the chief. And I'll also want to talk a little bit about why police disciplinary records are not part of the public record in total. But before I do that, I definitely would like to have Jen Estrada step in on the call if she's still available.
Hi, good evening. I'm Jennifer Estrada, and I've been with the police department here for 15 years as a jail administrator. I've been in the profession for 26 years, and I'm also born and raised in the city of Santa Monica, and I have a vested interest in our city. The events of May 31st unfolded quickly. At the time, we only had 3 custody officers that were working, and we also have a full jail at the police station. Those 3 custody officers were attending to the 7 inmates that we had in custody. When the events unfolded quickly, I self-deployed here. I immediately started contacting all of the jail staff to please report in. I provided my input on the best location based on my experience for a jail where we could quickly process people in and out, but ultimately that was not my decision to be made. It was determined that we were going to set up at the airport, which had a bunch of logistical challenges. It was not secure. There were no restrooms. One of our biggest challenges, we did not want to release these busloads of arrestees that were boisterous. They were upset. They were crude. And we didn't want to release those arrestees into our community, which would be over there by the airport. So there was a lot of logistical challenges getting those arrestees processed in. By the middle of the morning, we only had 11 custody officers. And with that 11, we had 3 at the jail, the 3 at the mobile field jail, and then we had the other custody officers that were assisting in transporting arrestees from the field to the mobile field jail. And these are custody officers that have never worked in the field. So they're out there in our jail transportation vehicle, getting rocks and bottles and pieces of concrete thrown at them. And they're responding to these code 3 calls to help assist transporting these people out of that environment. It became extremely hectic, to say the least, when you have 300 people in intervals being dropped off at that mobile field jail, bus loads at a time, and not knowing what those people are arrested for, or it's agencies you've never even heard of where they're assisting us. It immediately became apparent that we were over our head. And thankfully, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department provided us some resources to assist us in getting these people processed and released. We did not have the adequate supplies to safely release some of these people. We immediately identified that issue. And matter of fact, some of the custody officers were running to the Circle K to try to get snips to cut off these flex cuffs. One of the custody officers went the morning of the 1st, so he had worked all night long and then into the early morning hours, and went to Home Depot out of his own pocket, purchased snips. It was a learning experience, to say the least, for all of us, but we have learned from that. We immediately started creating mass arrest kits. So we have in our Sallyport boxes that have all the supplies needed for a field jail. We also have contracts in place with companies to provide fencing, mobile toilets, hand washing stations. We have boxes with COVID-19 supplies to protect the inmates and as well as us. We did put those policies in place. We have practiced them about 2 or 3 times in the last year. We deployed a field jail for the election. We also deployed the field jail for the impending trial. So we got to do test runs of what we had in place, and we were successful in both of those runs.
Thank you. I just want to do a check-in on time, Chief, and we had talked about potentially going a little bit longer. I feel like we do need more time. Could you maybe let everyone know what time you'd be comfortable going until? Because I have a question that I want to ask you in a few more. Are you comfortable with 8:20, 8:30? What are you thinking?
I am. That's fine. Because I want to make sure that, we get to the crux of some of the questions, and I was taking a moment to look through them, and I've kind of put them together as well. So I think between the two of us, we'll get through these questions, even as I'm weaving other narrative in. So I think we're good. And then if there's if there's insights or something that I think someone else is better suited to share, I've got, the folks are still on the call, and we can punt to them as well.
So one question, what role does the City Council play in the in all of this and in the Office of Emergency Management? What's the connection?
Well, I think the Office of Emergency Management is another division of the city, and what it does is it is the central entity for the oversight and management of the resource allocations that are necessary to manage a particular large-scale, long-duration type event. So in this case, the Office of Emergency Management would be the entity through which we make requests for resources such as trucks to assist us in blocking off certain ingress or egress routes, and making sure that we have what we need to facilitate traffic circulation during a circumstance such as this. And if there's other things that we need, to Administrator Estrada's point, if we need porta-johns or other things to set up the mobile field jail, this is how we make those requests so that police staff are not sucked into that aspect of the problem, and we can focus on the public safety order maintenance component that's important in situations like this. So that's what that is, and that is a separate division that falls under the auspices of the city manager's office. As it relates to, because there's also a component of that, how does that relate to accountability and things like that? Well, the police department is an operating department within the city's municipal structure. As such, I report directly to the city manager, who reports directly to the council, and I'm accountable to him individually and then equally to the city council. I don't feel that the police chief is not accountable for those things. But as the appointing authority for the police chief or the employee termination, the termination of the police chief, that is within the jurisdiction of the city manager.
Okay, so there's a couple, first of all, if you have a question, put it in the chat. There was a comment that we haven't been taking questions, so just to clarify, we actually have been taking questions. We have been addressing, actually for about the last 30 minutes, questions in from the chat, just so you know that. If you do have a question, please put it in. It's hard to get to every question. We'll do our best. I would also, for the police department, take these questions. Any questions that are not answered, we'll try to address them as well. Debbie, let's take a minute. Is there any specific question that you want to bring to our attention right now? Give you a moment on that if there's anything that you want to bring to our attention. And I wanted to, while we're doing this, if police chief, if you can, I wanted to talk about de-escalation, tactics and what's been done there. Obviously, there's been all sorts of, issues with how the police deals with people. I'd also like to understand what is and what is not allowed with protesters. You talked about that a little bit, looting. I also heard all sorts of things of what we should have done to looters. And so I think it would be helpful just to clarify really what is okay and what is not there.
Okay, well, let's start off with de-escalation. The police department does de-escalation every day. We have a policy that requires de-escalation. And that just means undertaking those steps, using those techniques, using those approaches that minimize the tension amongst the parties when we are called to the scene. And that means that we do all that we can to bring the situation down. We teach our employees a variety of techniques. Back in the day, we called it verbal judo. It might be called crisis communication. It can be just called regular sensitive engagements. I mean, a whole variety of different nomenclature applies to how we go about this. Sometimes it's just a matter of understanding how to relate to the person in the space that we find them in. And not coming in saying, we're the police and you're going to do what we said. Not that, but taking a different approach. So we expose our personnel to the obligation to de-escalate situations to the degree possible, to the degree that we do that. Now, I have to be clear, not every situation is going to be subject to that, because sometimes the situation is already at a level where we have to come in at a different level. But where we can, clearly there's an expectation, I have an expectation, that we will employ de-escalation tools as appropriate. As it relates to looters, I think, what we have to remember with looters, they're thieves. And the police department doesn't shoot thieves. And so at the end of the day, looting is just aggressive thievery, where because of sheer number and the sheer amount of things that are stolen, this is what's happening, and it's happening under the umbrella of generalized chaos. Because we have thieves in the city every day. Our retail businesses can attest to that, so I'm not saying anything that isn't new. I think, and our response to them in the ordinary isn't that we do, these ridiculously violent things that wouldn't even meet the sniff test anywhere close to de-escalation. So what we do is, in those situations, we have a decision to make. What is the greater good that's achieved? And this goes back to that conversation earlier when I was talking about hearing the Baltimore mayor talk about it in the context of the unrest that they experienced. That level of thievery, if we can interdict it in a way without compromising our greater mission, great, arrest thieves, because that's what we're here for. But there are those occasions where if we are supremely outnumbered by the sheer volume of what's happening relative to the number of officers that were available, which is what was happening in the early hours of 5/31, then there's going to be the seeming, oh, that was allowed. No, it wasn't allowed, because later we went back and we did aggressive follow-up using video, using surveillance, using the various tools, investigative tools at our disposal, coupled with citizen participation by citizens in the community providing video evidence, and we did follow-ups that resulted in arrests and conviction, and people are on, federal crimes. People were charged with. They were also charged with state offenses. So I think in a lot of ways, we did address the looters. Did we deal with them in the same volume within which they came into the city and did damage? No, because we just didn't have the number of people to deal with that. And when it came down to it, the other two priorities, remember, life safety and order maintenance, took a priority over that. And that's the part that's regrettable, because we understand that in having some of that occur, that put business owners at a disadvantage. I did see in the chat that the question had come up again about whether or not certain business owners were told beforehand. I have no evidence of that being true. The reality, I think the comment was, oh, and the media said this. Well, I'm going to just say this because I believe it. Not everything that you hear in the news and not everything that you read in the paper is accurate. So I don't know where that information came from, and there's no way to track it down at this point. I am under no impression whatsoever that we gave preferential advance notice to certain businesses. I don't know where people would have gotten that from, and there's no more I can say about that particular fact. As presented, I'm not saying it's a fact, just that question as presented as fact.
So I think an interesting question here. Also, Debbie, I just want to check in with you. Are there any specific themes or questions that are trending that you want us to address at this point? Or I can ask a question and circle back. Is there anything that you want to add, Debbie, from the chat?
I have been monitoring the chat. There is a question here about plans for the future regarding use of city trucks or other vehicles to block streets. Early warning phone trees with neighborhoods and with business owners, with block captains perhaps. Is that something that you could address?
Yes. Let me start with items 27, recommendation responses 27 and 28, as those relate to the police department's interface with public works. We will be, if we are faced with a similar situation, we now have the civil unrest annex, and when that is stood up, it allows us to have ready access to vehicles that we need from public works, from Big Blue Bus, so that we can then protect the community in as best way as possible by blocking off at least the main arterials that represent the primary points of ingress and egress in our community. So we have worked that through since 5/31 to be sure that looking ahead, should we need that, we have it, and we have touched on that in the, as we went through some critical dates earlier this year and into late last year. So that part has already been addressed.
Yeah, and there's a couple of other questions I want to make sure we get to before we lose time. There's a question here about whether the outgoing police chief got a pension or not. And I think the other question we want to circle back on is the PRAs and the text messages.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, because I know we had touched on that. I don't know if the outgoing chief actually retired to collect a pension, which is what is required. I think everybody knows, it's a matter of public record, that there was a severance package. There was a special meeting of the city council to approve that severance package, and it was provided to her. The question is why. That is a question that is best directed at the city council, since that is a council decision. I can speculate, but I don't want to engage in such activity, on the reputation of the former chief. So I'll just leave it right there. And then as to the public information request, I do know that The city was asked about the exchange of text messages and whether or not those were actually uploaded from, if they were made to private cell phones, were those messages then emailed to the city accounts in accord with municipal policy. I understand that there were some challenges with that, and that there was no responsiveness to the request other than to say they couldn't find anything. As it stands, that has been a major point of policy development, or not policy development, but training here at the executive staff level, and we have since put into place and reinforced the policies of the city to ensure that that's done looking ahead. And that's kind of where that is. You know, it's one of those things where there's a number of policies, both internally and externally, that govern our communications and things like that. And the question then becomes, was this done because the folks coming into the administrative roles were new in those roles and perhaps didn't understand the scope of everything? That's very likely. So it's important that we understand that every shortcoming isn't misconduct. It may be that shortcoming is best remedied by more specific training and education, as is the case with the body-worn cameras. Under the circumstances of the unrest, where we have identified challenges and problems, what we have tried to do is use stronger policies and more focused training as a way to address those issues, and where we find willful intent, we'll undertake the appropriate corrective action. This then leads to the question as to why is that information not a matter of public record? Well, state law, through the form of the Police Officers' Bill of Rights, requires that personnel records are confidential documents. Discipline is a matter of personnel record and is therefore confidential. So we cannot say that this employee was disciplined for this. What we can do is put out generalized information about corrective action undertaken as the result of formal investigations, and we do produce that information, and it's accessible on our website. The information is currently being updated and uploaded to our website by our internal affairs staff. I believe the most recent information, if you want to see where we are, along with, as an ancillary note, along with our Part 1 crime data, you can get that information from our website or be pointed via hyperlink to another website that does produce that information. Because we're in our efforts to be more transparent, we are trying to put more information, push more information out. When I was here last, we were directly on that path. Clearly, a different administration may have a different viewpoint of those things and handle things differently, which is why, you know, now we're going back and providing that information, because to speak to that question of the council's role in accountability, they have stood up a public safety reform and oversight committee that will also assist us by making a series of cogent recommendations over time about things that enhance the police department's accountability, that enhances its responsiveness to the community at large. And we have every intent to cooperate with that entity as we go about doing our collective work to make this an enhanced police department that does stand up to its goal, its stated goal of being the benchmark for excellence in the profession. So I think it's important that we talk about that. So I've covered the issue of why police disciplinary records are not necessarily automatically a matter of public record. However, there are some recent assembly bills that have passed through the California legislature that do require that there is certain information that we put out that is a matter of public record, that is rooted in discipline. And those records have to do with allegations of sexual misconduct, officer-involved shootings, and a few other things. And you can find more information, I believe it's 1462 Senate bill. You can find out more about that information by looking at our website, because we are making that information public in accordance with law.
Thank you. And Debbie, let us know if there are any other questions you want to address. But in the last few minutes, I thought it could be helpful to really talk about how do we move forward, and what is specifically, there was a great question that I was going to address as well, but the question if I can find it, was what efforts towards healing and reconciliation with the city, with the community, are planned by the city. And so I think that's a really important question. We've talked about trust, but can you talk about that, and really how do we move forward from here?
Well, I think one of the first ways of moving forward is having a conversation like this, because it's through conversations like this that while people will always have a different viewpoint, and we saw some of those expressed within the chat about, certain things, I think it's important that at a point we have to extend grace, and we have to understand that this was a sad day for the community. It was a sad day for the police department. And we collectively experienced something that we never thought we would as a community. Now that we have to understand that, there's a point when we have to understand what happened. We have to commit to doing better work so that we're prepared differently, so that we don't get the same outcome were we confronted with a similar situation. I think the police department has undergone that work. And now we look to see if the community will extend a bit of grace to allow us to show, not just talk about, but show over time that we remain committed to this community. And you heard that a large number of the people who, in fact, just about everybody has some connection, either directly or indirectly, to this community. We're not just a bunch of, carpetbaggers who come in, collect a check, and go home. I mean, people here have families here, they have histories here, and where they don't, they have a history like I do of over, 27, 28 years of service. So I think it's important that we now look ahead and we say, okay, now this is what you said you're going to do. We're going to be watching to see that you do that. But while we do that, we'll extend grace this time. And because at a point, if we keep going back to that, there is no healing and there's no forward progress. The city has a new city council, different than it had before. You'll have a new police chief in the next, 90 to 120 days, if not significantly less. We will have a new city manager in mid-October. And so the seeds of evolution are being cast and have been cast. And I think we now need to realize that we are evolving and we're moving forward. And it's important that we look at this so that we don't repeat the history that gave rise to this, but that we are optimistic about how beneficial our future can be. We're coming, the city is returning to a level of busyness. There's a lot of things that are happening that speak to vitality. And while we'll never forget this, because let's be clear, we still talk about the 92 unrest. We still talk about the 65 unrest that happened in Los Angeles, to which Santa Monica sent officers back then. We still talk about these things because they're still learning lessons that are applicable today. So just because we stop talking about it or it takes a different position in our mindset today doesn't mean that we're going to forget about it. Doesn't mean that, we're just trying to get over it. What we're trying to do is to work through it. And we need the grace extended to be able to do that. And we also have to, as a police department, extend a bit of grace to ourselves so that we know that it's okay that we push through this and we take advantage of the learning lessons and apply them routinely.
And so specifically with, I think everything you said makes sense and is true, but with specific, there's a lot of different levels of healing, we know. And so all of that needs to happen. On the external front, are there ways, there's a really great suggestion I love in the chat, would it be possible for the chiefs of the Santa Monica Police Department and Santa Monica Fire Department to have monthly or quarterly Zoom meetings with the public? And so one thing I want to get at is communication, right? So how do we have, when we're talking about transparency, we're talking about trust, there needs to be more communication in terms of what is happening. Often when you ask a question, well, what's crime? Like you can't even get an answer, right? And so we sometimes it's difficult to, get an answer on some things. So is there a way that we can commit to, or is there someone from your department that, maybe Susie, but where we can say, yes, we're going to make this effort and here's what we commit to, but I think it's two-way. We need to know, what do the residents want? What does the business community want, right? And so can you talk specifically of how do we address those and what are specific steps we can commit to and then build upon?
Well, I think specifically we have a community affairs office that is headed up by Sergeant Erica Cluffe, and that's where Susie Lockwood works, and also Miss Maisha Morrison. And I think what's important is we can't lose sight of two things. We have been communicating, but people have lives, and their lives take them in different ways until the issue comes home to the front door. And I think this is what's happened with 531. It's come home to the front door, and the perception has been, oh, well, nobody told me, the police department hasn't been talking. Oh no, we've been talking. We've been talking in the form of town hall meetings. We've been talking in the form of the community, attending the neighborhood association meetings. We've And then when the community said we want more NROs, we expanded that. We heard that. When they asked for more homeless liaison program officers, we heard that. So to say that there's not engagement, to say that there's not listening, to say that we're not responsive, I think that those things are a misnomer, and I think it's a bit of hyperbole, because we have been here, we have been engaged, we have been listening, but I think people haven't been leveraging their part of the social contract. Now, the commitment that I'd like to see happen is for all of the people who shook their fists in outrage at a terrible outcome, I'd like to see those people equally commit to work with us to share the message more broadly in the community about what services the police department has, how we can help to make them feel safer in their community, the action steps that we can undertake, how do we open our doors differently when we get to this post-COVID, or at least reasonably post-COVID world. How do we engage? How does the community want to engage with us? Because I think the issue is, we can tell you, yeah, we do the neighborhood meetings, we have coffee with a cop, we have all of these different things that we do, and we only touch a very small percentage of the 93,000 people who live here. And I think we've got to find a way, okay, how do we reach that other percentage that's not the usual folks who are engaging with us, who are here with us all the time, some of whom are on this call this evening. So I think we need to, to be looking at that to see what we can do and how the community how we can differently partner. And I think that's a conversation that comes when we have a new fire chief, when we have a new police chief, when we have the city manager seated, so that the consistency isn't, well, Chief Seabrooks said she would do this, but now maybe the new chief doesn't feel the same way. Or if he or she does feel the same way, then, okay, great, there's an overlap. But we need to make sure that there's that consistency that really reflects what the community wants, because that will transcend and drive the decisions of the person who sits in this and other leadership seats around the departments, whether police or fire or city hall for that matter.
And so really just two last questions. One, I want to give you an opportunity just to share any last thoughts, but in terms of accountability and in terms of following up with the report, how do people track this? To know, obviously we know that you put a status with each of those, but if someone wants to in a month or 2 months check in and be like, oh, where are we now? How do we do that? How do we know that we have this report, you did your report? How do we know that we're continually making progress and where things stand?
Well, we will continue to make progress because we have to report this. This is a report that was forwarded to the police, the Public Safety Reform and Oversight Committee. So now they will then create an action plan, if they've not already done it, that addresses their work on this as well. And so that's one mechanism for asking for accountability. The other way to do that is to contact us directly with the questions through our community affairs section, and we can get answers back. The other way is to bring up the issues in the city council venue, in the public comment venue. There's a variety of ways to ensure that this is thing. It's not going to go away. It's not going to fall off the radar screen. The next chief is now got the seminal documents that he or she needs to evaluate and to move forward. But I also want to make sure that I leave that person the space to determine how does he or she see the best path forward. I just wanted to set the stage. Now we know that roughly in, let's just say, 90 days or so, the new chief will be seated. This is the time. That would be the optimum time for that person to undertake a review. I'm sure, at a point, the person will already have reviewed these documents, but that's where that person will begin to formulate, okay, here's through work with community affairs, et cetera, within the organization and in the city, here's how we can then begin to move forward with what all of this means and how I can continue to keep the spark alive on this particular work.
Right, that makes sense. With one question here coming in that I wanted to address is, how is the conversation developing with the Public Safety Reform and Oversight Committee? Do you have any comments on that?
We are currently working with them on acclimating them to the department's critical processes, such as internal affairs, such as investigative processes, because, if they're going to be making recommendations on policies that affect how this organization operates, they need to have a baseline level of understanding about, well, where are we operating right now? And then their recommendations will be in the context of, this is where you are, this is where you need to be. Or this is where you are, we thought you might have been here. We're happy with that. So we have to give them some acclimation time. And so they're going, even as they're doing their work, they are also meeting with us so that we can provide them, and not just us, but the city attorney's office and relevant other offices can provide insight about how the work of the Santa Monica Police Department gets done and what are the legal contours of that work. So that's happening right now. And we're making sure that they are as informed as they can be. We're addressing the questions that reasonably we should be addressing that come from them, providing this document this information item that we just did, the 19-page document, is actually a response that goes to them. So, clearly we're doing the work that we are obligated to do, required to do, and that good sense and accountability expect of us.
Thank you. So if there are any questions, Debbie, can you add an email if anyone has follow-up questions where they can put any additional questions in? And again, the purpose of our town hall tonight, I know there's a lot of questions that people have, but our focus here was really to discuss the police department's response to the OIR report and the recommendations. And so there were some questions that were not answered. We apologize, but you can email them and we will address all of them. Please, Chief, I just wanted to give you the last minute or two really to just give us your final words and really, just thank everyone for being here. And I want to thank everyone for being here and taking the time to do this. But any final words that you want to share?
Yes. First of all, I want to say thank you to Dr. Cortez, Sergeant Leyva, Lieutenant Flores, Administrator Estrada, Ms. Morrison, and while we didn't hear from Ms. Lockwood, I know that she's on. And then in the background are Ms. Debbie Lee, all of the support staff who are working through setting up the call tonight, and then Ms. Boleyn Sahagwan from my office. Thank you guys all for doing your work so that we could put on this important conversation. And then Alyssa, to you, thank you for taking the time to work with us on this conversation. I think it is exceedingly important that this is the first foray into what was the police department's response on the OIR report. I say the first foray because, to your point earlier, there will be other conversations. There will be other dialogues. There will be other needs for the police department, maybe using this forum, maybe using a different forum to share information and insights. And I have a feeling this and other forums, right? To share insights and valuable insights and information about the operation of the police department. And then to the community, I say this: for those of you who have tuned in, thank you for tuning in. For those of you, share this with 10 of your friends because we did record all of this. I do think that this has been beneficial for me to see the questions. I'm looking forward to seeing the other 26 questions that had since popped up in the last 12 minutes, so that we have the opportunity to address those questions as well. But know this, the men and women of the Santa Monica Police Department are committed to providing top-notch public safety services. This department has been around for over 125 years. Did we get it right for the first 10 hours of May 31st, 2020? No, we didn't. And we apologize to you for that. We have since learned. We are continuing to learn. We're an evolving and learning organization, and we've been that for a long time. And I've been here since 1982, on and off, and I know. We are not that agency, and we are not the worst case agencies that you often hear about in the larger environment. We didn't meet the expectation. We understand it. We've now picked up that gauntlet, and we're running with it. And I can assure you that under a different set of facts or the same set of facts as they may materialize at some point, hopefully not, but should they, we've got you and we're here for it. And we appreciate all that you do to support. I appreciate all that you do to support the men and women of the Santa Monica Police Department, and I would ask that you continue to do so moving forward. They're a fine bunch, and I stand by them one and all. And that's all I got for you.
Thank you all so much. Where can we find a recording of this meeting? This will be, where will
this was recorded, and it can be viewed in full on YouTube, the city's YouTube channel. There's a link to it from our city's website, and that's www.santamonica.gov.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Good night. We appreciate you being here, and we can do more of this as well. So thank you, and we appreciate everyone's input.
Thank you, and good night.